That's good. Yes, so like I said, we're done with domain number 1, which had to do with cloud concepts, about 25 to 30% of the exam. We're also done with domain number 2, which has to do with the architecture and services in the cloud. So cloud domain 2 had to do with architecture and services. We're going to start today with domain 3, which has to do with Azure management and governance. So domain 1, we talked about the cloud computing, quick description of the models, use cases for each model, the consumption-based model, pricing models, as well as shared responsibility. We also talked about benefits of using the cloud, all those key terms like high availability, scalability, reliability, predictability, security, governance, and manageability. Finally, we talked about those different service types. Infrastructure as a service, where you get the hardware. Platform as a service, where they build the environment for you. Software as a service, where they provide the entire software for you. And also identifying each of those use cases. We talked about private, public, and hybrid, as well as multi-cloud. All of that was describing cloud concepts. Last week, we started off with architecture and services. Architecture has to do with the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, as well as the management infrastructure. The physical infrastructure, the primary thing in there is the data centers. The data centers could be in availability zones, and an availability zone could be in a region, or a region could have one or more availability zones. There are some regions that are sovereign regions. For instance, when you're thinking about the United States government, they would want their region to not be mixed with that of China, Germany, or the public. Okay, so we talked about those, as well as the resource, which is the primary building block for managerial infrastructure. So everything you deploy on the cloud is a resource, be it a virtual machine, a virtual desktop, or storage, whichever of those services all fall under resources. And these resources could be grouped together to get a resource group. If you know you need 3 resources to come up with an application, you can group them all together into a resource group. Those resource groups can also be a subset of a subscription. Subscriptions, though, are what is used for billing. So you can decide to have a subscription for each department or a subscription for each environment, and then you can track how the cost is going to be allocated. And then after talking about the architecture, we went straight into services. We did mention that there are 3 primary services, which are compute services, networking services, and storage services. For the compute and networking services, we talked about virtual machines. We could also have scale sets for the virtual machines. We talked about availability sets as well in the virtual machines, and virtual desktops. We also described some of the application hosting options like web apps and containers and so on and so forth, Azure App Services in containers or virtual machines. And we've talked about networking, virtual networks that are used to branch these services or resources together. We could have our network broken into subnets, and we can have endpoints, which is what is actually used to access each resource. If you're going to have 2 resources on different subnets or different virtual networks talking to one another, then you use peering. And you can set up VPN gateways to help you connect directly from your on-premises private network to your Azure private network, because you don't want to go over the internet, which is public, and you can have hackers intercepting your information. But if all networks are within the Microsoft backbone, then you can use express route and you don't have to go through the public internet. So that was about it for networking. Like I said, networking is a more technical piece. But then when we went to storage, we realized storage could have different tiers. Storage services could also be of different types. You could have a blob, which is a binary large object. You could have files, you could have disks, you could have tables. And we talked about all of those, and there are different redundancy options. Do you want it to be redundant within a data center or across availability zones, or to be geo-redundant across regions? And how do you want the redundancy to be? Is it read only or read access redundancy? We also had to mention, if you need to copy information from one location to another, you can use the command line, either PowerShell or Bash, to use AZ copy. But if you prefer using the GUI, the graphical user interface, then you can use the Azure Storage Explorer. But if you need the files to be always synchronized, then you need to use Azure File Sync to make sure changes in one zone, or let's say change on premises, is the same as change on the cloud, and vice versa. Also, if you need to move your data for one reason or another, maybe there was a catastrophe, you need to get a backup copy, or you need to start off to the cloud, you can use Azure data boxes, physical boxes that can be used to ship them periodically or as need be, or you can use Azure Migrate, which is going to do that for you on the fly. Yesterday, we talked about identity, access, and security. Pretty much talking about the Active Directory, similar to on-premises Active Directory. You need that to be able to track users, services, as well as to be able to look at your products. So managing all of those needs to be done using Azure data, Azure Active Directory. So we talked about using the domain service as well to be able to use set up the controller, the domain controller, to set up your domain regions and domain zones and so on and so forth. But we went ahead and said a little bit about security, mentioning things like single sign-on, multi-factor authenticator or authentication, and passwordless authentication. So we were also able to look at how guest access is set up on Azure, and conditional access, which is really powerful to be able to mitigate attacks, being that you can set up when, where, and what is actually connecting to your network. Now we also mentioned role-based access control, where you actually grant access to a particular role, and then you can add users or group of users to that role, and having the more secure method of zero trust, where you build a policy with all the trust rules or configurations, and then you have those policies tied to each resource at the resources location, rather than having all resources on one private network and shutting it down. Once that gets infiltrated, then all your services get infiltrated. So finally, we talked about defense in depth, which had to do about the different layers of defense to mitigate the attack of our services or our resources, and Microsoft Cloud Defender for the cloud. What are we going to talk about today? The content for today. Yes, Mr. Adolf.
Yes, sir. So yesterday we were talking about identity and access management. So I got a question when I was reading through today. I thought about the RSA key. How is it being generated and linked with our firewall? Like, as it with the firewall to authenticate right users. So that was one question I had in mind.
Okay, very good question. So you mentioned about the RSA key and how it's used for authentication. I think for the level of this exam, we don't need to understand that much detail, but what happens is every person, in the case that you're using that for authentication, it's usually when you're looking at say private versus virtual, should I say private versus a public network. So in order for you to be granted access, normally you would have every person has a private key. You having a private key means if I send you a package, only you can open that package, right? But everybody has your public key, meaning if I want to send information to you, I use your public key. So everybody's public key is published onto the web or published to everybody, but you do not publish your private key. So in order for me to be granted access into any particular system, I have to use my private key in that case. So think about me having to send you a package. I have to use a particular key to make sure that this, when it goes routing through the network, it checks each one of those keys. Your key is not going to match with A or B or C's key until it gets to your delivery post where it matches. So again, think about the postman, the mailman going to each house, checking the address. If it's the right address, the mail is delivered. If it's not the right address, the mail is not delivered. So you, on the other hand, are the only one that has the key to open that package that has been delivered. It has been delivered to your public address, but only you has your personal private key that you can open that and get the contents of the box. So using private and public keys, that's how you go ahead to establish that. But it's definitely beyond the scope of this class. It's more centered towards cybersecurity and understanding how authentication happens to public and private keys. Sounds good?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You are welcome. Very good question. But I'll also send you a link to learn more about how the RSA keys, public and private keys, function.
I appreciate that. Yes.
Awesome. So for domain 3 today, the content is actually not that much. Technically, we can finish all of this today, but I would hate to rush through all of this, okay? So what I'll do today is we'll cover the cost management in Azure. So cost management in Azure is going to include the factors that affect cost in Azure. I know we talked about cost a little bit in the beginning when we talked about consumption-based pricing model, but today we're going to talk about the factors that affect it, right? And we'll look at some tools that are being used, like the cost management and billing tool. We'll also look at tags. Tags are very useful in helping us manage our costs and keeping track of which cost center or which region or which project is, costing us less or more money. So two ways in which we can look at pricing on Azure. We can use a pricing calculator, or we can use the total cost of ownership. That all of these we'll talk about in the first part of our lecture today. And then in the second part of our lecture, we'll jump into governance and compliance. So this is just to make life easier for you because you don't want to go ahead and set up standards or set up policies for each one of your resources. You can have a blueprint just like your house blueprint. Once you have a blueprint, you can reuse it as many times as you need. The blueprint actually has policies, so we'll talk about policies as well. And a bunch of policies or a group of policies becomes an initiative. So a policy, for instance, could be creating a virtual machine to meet a particular configuration, so that the next time you want to create a virtual machine, you can just fire up that policy. Once you fire up that policy, it gets created on the fly with a snap of a finger, rather than you having to go through every single step you did the previous time. We'll also talk about resource locks, just to make sure that you don't mistakenly delete or change some of your resources, you can put a lock on it and change it whenever you need it. So at the end of the day, we are going to explore the Service Trust portal. So this is just a portal. A portal, again, is just a coming together area that Microsoft has developed to have all their standards and procedures on there, so that all those customers that are using Azure can explore it to see the different standards that are met when you keep your data or when you use Azure for all your business purposes. So it helps you to be able to stay compliant, and also when government requirements or whatever requirements you're looking at are met. So these two we're going to cover today: cost management and the tools and features of governance and compliance. Tomorrow, we'll round up with managing and deploying Azure resources, as well as describing how we are going to monitor Azure. Things like the Azure Advisor, Azure Health Services, Azure Monitor are going to be covered tomorrow. We'll also explore the Azure portal a little bit more. We'll look at the Cloud Shell, which includes Bash or Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. And we'll talk about the purpose of Azure Arc as well as Azure Resource Manager. Like I said, not much left. By the end of this week, next week, you should be able to write your exam. Not just write your exam, you should be able to knock it off, like knock it out of the park. But that said, what questions do you have? If you go onto our class website, not the class website, on the classroom on Google, you should be able to see I've updated the videos. Yesterday's video has been included, and I'm also working on a few quizzes that I'll share with you. And the quiz is going to be for each section. For instance, the first quiz is going to be for domain 1. The second quiz is going to be for domain 2. And the third quiz is going to be for domain 3. At the end of the day, I'm also going to have a exam prep, which is going to have all these 3 domains, in a shuffled order, not necessarily in that order. But this will help you understand, okay, is my strength in domain 1, or am I having a weakness in domain 2, or do I need to revisit domain 3 to be able to understand where you should focus on before writing the exam. But practice, like I said, makes perfect. We should be able to go from there. Again, we've had identity, access and security, PDF and slides posted, as well as the video. After we're done with cost management and governance and compliance, I'll go ahead and send that update for you. That said, let's jump into our website. So on the website, again, events. On here, you can see the latest event is session 8 for today. We're going to go ahead and dive into, oops, I need to click on read more. Okay, from here, I should go to the dedicated page for session 8, and we can dive into the curriculum. One more time, what questions do you have before we jump into the curriculum? No questions. Well, let's dive in.